Um, Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining today's session. So we're here today to be discussing confronting antimicrobial resistance through sustainable antibiotic research and development, equitable access, and responsible stewardship. This session is co-hosted by the World Health Organization and the Wellcome Trust, and who are both committed in supporting efforts to reduce antimicrobial resistance, which I'll be shortening to AMR for short for the rest of the day. My name is Sabrina Lamore-Julian. I'm the research lead for therapeutics within infectious diseases at the Wellcome Trust, and I'll be chairing today's session. I'm joined here today by my fellow panelists. I'm going one by one to the left of me. So first is Erin Duffy. She is the Chief of Research and Development at CARB. This will be followed by Michael Lobritz, the Head of Antibiotics Early Development at Roche. Following him is Henry Skinner, CEO of the AMR Action Fund. And then finally, Subhasri Srinivasan, Medical Director at GUARDP. For today's panel, we really want to dive into different ways that we can tackle persistent threat of antimicrobial resistance. As we all know, drug-resistant infections continue to pose a persistent problem today and already contribute to at least 700,000 deaths a year, and its impact is felt unequal across the world. So it remains a complex health challenge involving multiple factors and pathways and stakeholders. One of those pathways is development of novel therapeutics, which is critical to overcome current resistance. But developing novel therapeutics faces some key economic challenges, especially for antibiotics, which is what we're going to be focusing on for today's session. There's few antibiotics in the market. It's very costly to develop with low economic returns, as we know, not only combined by the fact that antibiotics are typically sold quite cheaply, but then usually there's accompanied by low sale volumes due to the fact that with new antibiotics, you don't really want to sell them as much as possible. You want to keep them as a reserve. And so as a result, the antibiotic market today is relatively broken. There have been many initiatives and funding and support to support this ecosystem, including some of the panel members here today. But it is still remains to be a challenging problem, and especially given the COVID pandemic today, resources, financial resources, public health resources, all of these are extremely further strained, which makes it very tricky to actually overcome AMR. Moving along the R&D pathway from early development all the way through to implementation, alongside the R&D challenges and the economic market problems that I just mentioned, there's also other barriers that need to be faced with regards to stewardship and access. So of course, we need to have equitable access and responsible stewardship so that life-saving drugs actually reach patients and not to all those who need them, and also to actually effectively slow the rate of existing therapies, to lose their efficacy so that they can actually last longer. So all of these parts have an important role to play in AMR. And each of the different organizations joined me in the panel today complement each other in that sort of pathway along from R&D through to implementation. And this session, we will be discussing various different initiatives that are underway, and the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders, and what new mechanisms that we may need to solve the problem on AMR. First off, I shall invite one of my colleagues from the World Health Organization, Peter Bayer, to provide some initial thoughts and an update from the last AMR session that we had yesterday, that was on confronting AMR beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. After that, I will go around to each panel member, asking them to introduce themselves and give an opening statement / answering one of the questions that I'm posing them. Once we've gone through the panel and after Peter has given his speech, I'll then be inviting questions from the floor from each of you. And then my colleague Richard Hartwell will be then following on with some questions that we've been receiving from our online participants who are joining us remotely. So without further ado, I think I'll pass on to Peter to start.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That is very kind, giving me the floor. And I'm really looking forward to work with you as the Wellcome Trust. You're an important player in this whole antibacterial R&D environment. We had indeed already a session on AMR yesterday here in Berlin, and we really wanted to carve out other areas of AMR, because this is, of course, not only on R&D. So yesterday we covered the issues around One Health, issues around surveillance, in particular also from the One Health approach, that any future instrument for pandemic preparedness should also include surveillance of antimicrobial resistance, not be limited to viral infections, for example. We looked also at the issue of gene sequencing, and we discussed experiences that how we could learn from TB. We had Adrian Thomas from J&J, a company with a lot of experience in rolling out TB treatment. And this is something that we should look at in seeing how can we ensure better access to antibiotics, because innovation without access is not what we want to see. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think you did a really good job in getting all the important players in the R&D scene. I mean, except the industry, but we have CARB, we have the AMR Action Fund set up by the industry, and GUARDP and Roche is still active in preclinical development. So we are really looking forward. As WHO, what we are doing is we are looking at what are the R&D priorities, because what we want these entities to do is to focus on where are the most urgent needs in R&D. And that is not so easy to identify. At the moment, we're looking at fungal infections. We try to look at where do we have the biggest threats in terms of resistance. And we are going to publish this list of priorities for fungal infections early next year. We're also having another look at the bacterial infections of the period of next year. We continue to also monitor the pipeline and publishing reports where we really assess the antibiotics that are in clinical development. We will do this for fungal infections as well. And we have a report in preparation where we look at all the vaccines that are in preclinical and clinical development for bacterial infections, so that we can see for which bacteria is it realistic that we can expect a vaccine. And also very important in this context, how would that vaccine be used? Because we see now with COVID-19 that there is hesitancy also in the population to pick up vaccines. So that is something you have to build in when you do vaccine development from the very start. And with that, I think, Sabrina, I'll hand back to you. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Peter, for the update. I will now turn to the panelists. The first question I'm going to ask is for Michael. So can I ask, the first step in the chain of antibiotic development is basic research and early discovery. Considering current availability of funding and research capabilities in the antibiotics basic research and early discovery, how healthy is this stage of the ecosystem today?
Thanks, Brina. It's a great question. So first, I'd like to start by placing Roche within the context of the broader ecosystem. So Roche has a long legacy of innovation in antimicrobial agents, the development of trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole or Bactrim, development of ceftriaxone or Rocephin long ago. Roche, in a trend that was followed by many other large biopharmaceutical companies, exited the antibiotic space around 1999 due to the perception that unmet need was not that substantial at that point. However, reevaluating the unmet need, Roche re-entered the R&D space for antimicrobial agents in 2013. And currently, we have an active R&D group with a broad-based discovery portfolio and a recently advanced phase 1 clinical molecule. So where do we formally sit within the ecosystem in that context? So I would say that as a company, we are deeply embedded in the overall R&D ecosystem. And importantly, I would argue that we could do essentially nothing on our own. As I mentioned, there is an internal R&D effort, but we rely heavily upon external research and academic collaborations to advance our science. we rely upon external funding by organizations like BARDA to help support our research and development efforts. And we engage actively with the innovations that are being driven and supported by members of this panelist through collaborations with smaller biotech companies like Warp Drive Bio, which is now Ginkgo Biosciences, to discover new natural products that can become antibiotics, and through collaborations with focused biotechnology companies like Forge, a CARB funded organization, to develop new antibiotics. So what do I think of the R&D ecosystem currently? So I would frame myself as an optimistic realist about the current situation. And I want to say first that it is important to realize that with that ecosystem context, healthcare innovation simply cannot arise out of a vacuum. It requires resources, it requires a workforce, and it requires a robust ecosystem to maintain those. So first, I'll give you my optimistic point. And this is, again, looking at these organizations that sit on the panel with me. GUARDP, CARB, the beginning of the AMR Action Fund, BARDA, the Novo Fund. These are sponsors of innovation that are doing wonderful things. You can identify very specific foundational innovation coming from them. In fact, they breathe new life into the AMR space. Despite these bright spots, however, I believe that the AMR R&D sector is suffering. So I'm a physician by background. I'm an infectious disease physician, and I like to use medical technologies to try to understand more complicated issues. So I think of what's the state of the AMR R&D effort, and I think of the concept of the ventilator. Unfortunately, due to COVID, I think everyone is very familiar with a ventilator. It is a medical technology that aids in the breathing of patients who can no longer breathe on their own. I believe that the R&D funding system is very much like that ventilator. It is supplying the oxygen that is needed to keep things going. I learned a very valuable piece of information around ventilators when I was in my medical education. I was taught by a very smart intensive care doctor. And what he told me was that the problem with ventilators is that they don't actually cure any diseases. They keep the patient alive, they keep the oxygen there while the underlying problems are solved by other means. And I think that's where we are currently. And if I were to use a single word to describe the nature of our current R&D system, I would say fragility. The R&D ecosystem is fragile. If you look around who is engaged and at what level, the ecosystem hinges upon a small group of highly dedicated individuals who are continuing and focusing their efforts on this vast problem without significant hope that there will be substantive return on their innovations. I make one last comment around this, and I think it's useful in the session that happened yesterday and along many of the discussions at this summit around comparisons to health innovations that have arisen from COVID-19. I think that it is just tremendous to see how the entire healthcare ecosystem has responded to a global pandemic. The level and speed of innovation introduction is essentially unparalleled in our healthcare technologies. And I think that there is a lesson to be learned from that. And again, it is the same point that innovation does not arise out of a vacuum. Compared to bacterial diseases, we have had decades of sustained R&D investment into antiviral diseases. You can look back to the innovations that have come from the HIV pandemic, treatment for cure of hepatitis C, in forming the foundation of our understanding of how to develop novel antiviral agents, how neutralizing antibodies work and how they can be leveraged as human therapeutics, and continuous effort into vaccine technologies. Our ability to respond quickly to COVID-19 is predicated upon a robust R&D system that continuously created innovations that maybe were not directed at that virus, but that were leverageable and transitional over to that disease. systematic disinvestment in bacterial diseases has rendered us unable to do the same for antibiotic-resistant infections. Absent market reforms that I believe are necessary to sustain that investment in innovation, I'm at risk of becoming a pessimist. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. That wasn't that optimistic as I would have, as you said initially. Moving on, the next up is Erin from CARB-X. CARB-X plays a critical role through phase 1 of antibiotic R&D, and you place a great emphasis on product developers taking concrete steps to promote stewardship and access in low middle income countries. What do you require of product developers, and what support is there available for them?
Well, thank you, Sabrina. Yes, again, my name is Erin Duffy. I'm from CARB-X. I guess I would say that I'm a chronic optimist, I guess, just to put myself in context there. So prior to coming to CARB-X, I spent 18 years of my life in a small biotechnology company completely focused on antibiotics. It was begun as Ribex Pharmaceuticals, and following the launch of our first drug, alongside 3 that we acquired, our reward for that was that we filed for Chapter 11 protection, I think 9 months later. And so that was not great. I separated my entire team, but then Kevin Outerson at CARB-X, where actually we were supported for a preclinical program, did approach me and asked me to join the team and build an R&D team to support our efforts. And I did that. And so I'm banking on this all being very successful one day. So CARB-X, if you don't know of us, we are a global project that's domiciled at Boston University. We are funded by the US, the UK, and the German governments, as well as the Wellcome Trust Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have a singular focus, which is the build and maintenance of a robust preclinical pipeline of products that treat, prevent, and diagnose infections caused by these urgent and serious bacteria on the WHO and CDC lists. I should say, I guess, let's see, we were begun in 2016, and between then and 2022, we are on track to deploy about $480 million towards those efforts. Our focus is on the translational research and the early clinical development of these products. And we do look to everybody to the left of me to take those products on through advanced development and towards patients. Since inception, we've supported 92 unique projects across those 3 pillars of treatment, prevention, and diagnosis, and today have 58 active projects. We're uniquely focused on innovation. And just to give you a little sense of that, in our treatment portfolio, we have 35 projects. Of those 35, all but 1 feature a unique chemical class, a unique molecular target, a unique modality, or all of the above. From the outset, though, we recognize that innovation needs to be balanced, of course, by stewardship and access. Otherwise, we're not really doing any good in the system. It's important to note that contractually, we have language with every product developer that provides for, at the appropriate juncture, late in development, the preparation of a non-confidential steward and access plan, so that we're thinking about how to bring these medicines not only to high-income countries, but also low-income countries who need them. I should say, to facilitate that, this year, we finalized with our funders, GUARDP, Bio, and some of our product developers, what I think might be the world's first and most practical guide on how to develop one of these stewardship and access plans, which is not something that many of our product developers, in fact, maybe all of our product developers have thought about. I should say also that we've, as we've grown and learned and built this portfolio, we have increasingly encouraged our product developers to insert in their work plans a unit of work that would qualify for ODA or official development assistance, so that, again, we're addressing the needs of low and middle income countries. And then finally, I'd like to say that though we do deploy the financing that I've mentioned, and I should say it's completely non-dilutive with a very small cost share from our product developers, Funding alone is not sufficient here. I think the average size of the product developer that we support is about 20 people. There may be an outlier here or there, but that's the typical size. And so in addition to the funding, we provide a series of what we call wraparound services. And this includes certainly technical, scientific, clinical, and regulatory guidance that's done through subject matter experts. We have a very large pool of them that represent all of the key disciplines important to bring a product towards advanced development. That's also done by our R&D team internal to CARB-X. And finally, this year, we've launched a series of cross-project initiatives. Now at the sort of scale of a portfolio, we can ask questions about what are the common challenges that these product developers face and what can we do to help them overcome them on an ecosystem level. But in addition, as I said, we do look to advanced development partners to take the innovations and the early clinical programs forward to patients. And in order to do that, these entities actually need to remain alive and active. And so we do provide a number of business support too. So again, we're focused on innovation, building a pipeline that we hope will see some very important products coming out of in the near future.
Thank you, Erin. Next up is Henry. The AMR Action Fund will provide much needed late stage funding for clinical development and commercialization. How will the fund select its portfolio, and what support will you provide to ensure product developers take reasonable action in relation to stewardship and access in low middle income countries?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a good question. I think start with the fund was conceived by the WHO, the Wellcome Trust and pharmaceutical associations to really address the absence of investment in the later stage development. We've got groups like CARB-X, the Novo Repair Impact Fund, and BARDA that thank you. That has been funding the early stage, and thankfully we have that. So we have a pipeline to look at, and we're focused on the later stage clinical development. Our selection process is really focused on first identifying the critical patient need, the clinical need globally, to identify the areas we should invest in, aligned with the priority pathogens identified by WHO and CDC. So that's our starting point. And then we look at the capabilities of the company, the product profile. Will it address these critical needs? Is it financeable? Can we run the studies to demonstrate the utility and the like? And so that's the approach we're taking on the selection. We have $1 billion to dedicate to this over the next 10 years or so, with the goal of driving 2 to 4 new products to approval. Hopefully we can leverage this capital and bring others back into this ecosystem, investing in these products. I think that's challenging because of the market circumstances. I think just this past week, we saw a positive phase 3 readout by a company whose stock then went down, not up, which I think is unique in the pharmaceutical industry. Any other company in any other field would have had a substantial increase in their value. Yet in the AMR field, success actually brings additional challenges rather than upside. So that's the headwind we're facing in that. Part of what we're looking at is in that sense of the global need and where the patients are is just what's been outlined, similar to what CARB-X is doing, is, how do we help the companies approach developing these drugs so that they will be brought to the patients who need them around the world. I think that's a complex issue, really requires more than what these companies can do themselves, so that we can help them along those ways. It's going to take a partnership with governments, with regional authorities, with regulatory authorities, even just how do we bring these drugs into those countries and deliver them. Tying that to stewardship identifies additional challenges, but essential piece as we think about the links between innovation, access, and stewardship in a positive way to really limit the progression of resistance and the frequency with which we must develop new drugs. And as we think about that sustainability of that ecosystem, trying to bring access and stewardship in line tied to the innovation is, I think, the big challenges that we'll be approaching and trying to work with partners to bring about solutions there. So we, like CARB-X, we will have the companies move toward it, but we're going to need a lot of support and help to actually accomplish it.
Thank you, Henry. Lastly, to my final panel member, Suba. Why is achieving appropriate access to antibiotics in low middle income countries important for combating AMR as well as patient health? And how does GUARDP complement the activities of CARB-X and the AMR Action Fund?
Thank you, Sabrina. Hello to everybody. A little bit about GUARDP for folks who are not familiar with GUARDP. It is the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, which was conceived after the WHA AMR declaration, and it was conceived by WHO and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, and was incubated within DNDi initially, and then has become independent as of 2019. We are largely publicly funded by governments, Germany being a large contributor, as well as private foundations like the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation. We have been endorsed repeatedly by the G7 and G20 as a critical part of the antibiotic ecosystem, as has been detailed. We are based in Geneva in Switzerland. However, we have hubs in the US, UK, and South Africa. We also work through our sister agency, the DNDi, and have centers globally. Our mission is really to bring antibiotics, and by that I mean effective antibiotics, to everyone who needs them. And I think everybody in this room recognizes that people who need them the most, where the burden of AMR is the greatest, is really in low and middle income countries. In fact, if you look at many of the clinical trials for some of the recent antibiotics, they have been conducted in these same countries, because that's where you have the most chance of finding patients with these serious infections. While our mission, social mission, is one of equity and justice and so on, I think it is even more a mission of global health security and really sustaining global economies. I think we've all seen what has happened with COVID, and we can all attest to the fact that all of this, including AMR, which is this nebulous kind of idea, is really tied into global health security and really the global economy. In coming to a little bit on GUARDP, what we do and our strategy, I think we all recognize that antibiotics today form the bedrock of practice of medicine. I am an infectious disease physician, and I'm very conscious of what that is, and like others on this panel and in the audience. We have taken it for granted. You go into a hospital for a simple surgical procedure with the notion that you're going, if in case you get an infection, it's no big deal. You can get treated and you'll come back, safe and sound. That is what is being put at peril right now. While in US, UK, Europe, this is somewhat of a futuristic threat. There is it's a threat of AMR. In the low and middle income countries, it's an existential issue. It's happening now. If you have a chance of getting a multi-drug resistant infection in a hospital, and the order of those odds are 40, 50%, that changes everything you do in the way you practice medicine. I think that's the realization that we all need to have, that could potentially be a global issue sooner than we think. It is this with in mind that GUARDP has created its strategy. And it is based off of a public health strategy. in fact, it was, I'm told that it was at this very summit a couple of years ago that our strategy of 5 by 25 was launched, which was essentially bringing 5 molecules, not just new molecules, old and new, for patients everywhere. I can report that we are well on our way. We have 4 out of 5, and we'll have hopefully 5 by next year. So what is our strategy based on? So like I said, the first one is new and old agents. As Sabrina alluded to, I think there needs to be a recognition that yes, we need a pipeline, and we need a continuous pipeline of new antibiotics, which is what we have had for many years now. But at the same time, I think we can do a better job with the drugs that we do have. And, you know, how can we sort of manage upstream use of end-use antibiotics in order to reduce resistance while also developing newer solutions for some of these resistant pathogens. So that's number one in our strategy. So we have looked at new agents, we've looked at combinations of old agents, and that's part of our portfolio. The second pillar is really looking at special populations that have been either neglected, like pediatrics and neonates, or populations that are increasingly at risk for multi-drug resistant infections, such as those with multimorbidity, you know, diabetics, cancer patients, you know, and so on. The third pillar is around what you could call access, but it's really around generation of evidence. We believe that R&D does not stop with approval of a drug. In fact, there is a lot of work that needs to be done after. If antibiotics, especially newer antibiotics, are unique in the way they are being developed, and it is because of the regulatory pathways that have been created as incentives for more innovation. However, you know, unintentional consequences of that is that they come out with very little data at the end of, you know, the phase 3, and particularly in the populations that they're intended for, you know, in those multi-drug resistant pathogens, multi-drug resistant infections. There is actually a very little data compared to, let's say, a diabetes drug or a cardiovascular drug that comes out with tens of thousands of patients worth of data. And therefore, there is a lot of work that needs to be done after approval in the populations of interest to generate that data, to really understand the effectiveness of these antibiotics. And GUARDP is very involved with this piece of development, if you will. And it is a key part of how we will provide access in the regions that need it the most. And you know, the other aspects that are not always talked about, I mean, R&D is also about pharmaceutical development. And so, you know, making sure that we have sustainable supply of older agents, new agents, that they are manufactured responsibly, that, you know, antibiotics that are meant for human health, stay in human health, that are not used, you know, in the animal sector, for instance. These are all basic principles that are incorporated in everything that we do. I'll just give you a few examples of the kinds of projects that we're involved with. We take on projects that we think are not necessarily a good business case. For instance, we are partnered with Entasis Therapeutics to develop soliflodacin for drug-resistant gonorrhea, which does not exist in large form today, but it is an existential threat, and it will happen, and it will have effects on, for instance, HIV transmission and so on. But it doesn't have a great business case right now. But GUARDP is actually conducting the phase 3 pivotal trial for that drug. we are also partnered with Venatorix to help them develop cefepime-taniborbactam, but also to accelerate the pediatric indication for that drug, because there are regions in the world who really need a good drug such as that, especially in the pediatric population. We have signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, with a small Japanese company, Shionogi, for an approved drug, cefiderocol, and in partnership with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, hope to provide access to low and middle income countries to cefiderocol, which would be anticipated as a very important addition to the formulary for some of these countries. So these are examples of the kinds of novel agents that we have used. But in addition, I told you, we also look at older agents and see how best to use them. We've started to do a lot of combination studies to see if, if we use combinations of drugs, what does it do for drug resistance, for instance? Does it retard drug resistance? How can we spare agents such as carbapenems by using non-carbapenem agents? In this regard, we are about to launch next year one of the largest neonatal sepsis trials, which will enroll 3,000 babies globally, and will look at 3 new combinations of older drugs for treatment of neonatal sepsis. So in this way, we have, we have created a portfolio of drugs, but with a very, very broad kind of strategy. And how do we achieve all of this? We are a small agent, set of individuals. It is all through partnerships. GUARDP is not a funder. We actively partner, we take on the projects, and it's through these partnerships that we execute. And so I'll hand it back to, I guess, yeah.
Thank you very much, Suba, for your comprehensive answer on that. And now I'd like to take the opportunity to open to the floor for any questions that you would like to direct to any of our panel members. If you could formulate your question and then actually also highlight who you would like to answer. Any questions from the room?
Don't know if there we go. Kevin Alderson from CARB and Boston University. Really, it's for anyone, not any specific person, but let's assume that you don't want to be back here giving this talk in 5 or 10 years, right? So what really needs to change so that we actually improve this whole ecosystem and don't continue the need to talk about this at World Health Summit?
Who would like to answer this question first?
I'll take a start at it. I think it's a good question, Kevin. I think there's multiple things that we need. We need changes in the value proposition for antibiotics. We need there to be payment for innovation that recognizes the value that new antibiotics bring to the ecosystem and to patients, not just in the direct care of the patient treated, but also in the avoidance of future infections and accelerated resistance. And through that, we keep innovation going, and through that, we offer the opportunity to help facilitate access and stewardship globally. So I think these things are all linked. In the absence of those payment models that reward the innovation and the value proposition, I don't think we have innovation. And so we will always be back here unless we can link these things up together.
Thank you, Henry. Would anybody else like to add anything?
Yeah, can I add a point on top of that? I agree with Henry completely. I think that one of the core challenges for antibiotics is that we want to use them in the exact way that they're designed, which is sparingly. We want them to be used precisely for the patients who need them and not more. And I think that if we think about them as reserve agents, as agents that are designed for these last resort, there's a fundamental challenge of placing antibiotics into the typical reimbursement ecosystem of saying that we pay for the use based on volume. So I think that the delinkage, the fundamental delinkage between use as a value driver needs to be reformed. And you see beginnings of this in, for example, the UK subscription model. And I think this is a testament to the idea that delinkage as a core concept of how we reward that innovation is really critical.
Thing. I think in addition to this, one thing that, certainly beyond the market incentives, which are, a must here, we have this opportunity that was presented to us by COVID, actually two opportunities. And one was to learn from how we went from, we heard this yesterday, actually, gene sequences to the completion of clinical trials of vaccines in laser time, and that required some creativity and some willingness to embrace clinical trial protocols and regulatory strategy that certainly is a lot less conservative than we're used to. And I think if we want to continue to invigorate this pipeline, we're going to need to do that in antibiotics, and we have the opportunity to capitalize on that. I think likewise, an element of stewardship is having the antibiotics focused on, the pathogens of interest. And sometimes that can be, with a single pathogen focus, including the phase 3 readout that we heard last week on Acinetobacter. Well, actually nobody walks into the ER with a t-shirt saying, I have an Acinetobacter infection. And so the value of diagnostics is high there. And again, we have this opportunity with COVID that we never had before, which is we have an install base all over the world of diagnostic platforms. And so then we can encourage the creativity on the assay level without having to build the whole box over and over and over again. And I think those two things can really move the science and the regulatory bit along as we're working on these market incentives.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, just a quick one. I would actually say that I would probably want to continue to hear about AMR even 10 years from now, because if we stop talking about it as how we got here in the first place, I hope that it'll be a much more optimistic conversation, that we won't be talking about incentives and so on, but rather maybe how best to use, or how it was used, and those kinds of use case examples, and what can we replicate and how can we do things in the future. So with that's my brief response to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the room, from the audience? Oh, we've got one more person at the back.
Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Ella Zaraborn from the Technical University of Munich, and I was wondering what role does a systematic genomic surveillance play in the research and development of antibiotics? I know there are some projects, such as a global pneumococcal sequencing project, that focus on it, but I would just be interested on what role that plays in the practicalities of research and development of antibiotics. Thank you.
I mean, I can take a shot at it. Sure. So again, I think I mentioned that we are engaged in a series of cross-project initiatives to help across the portfolio, and actually two of them directly relate to your question. So in the first case, we have assembled with a CRO called IHMA, a broad panel of over 3,000 clinical isolates that represent the sort of breadth and depth of the pathogens for which we have, little to no therapies. And part of that is understanding at the genomic level, what the features are. And then what we've done is to do a large surveillance study of the molecules in our portfolio to not only ask the question, where are they today, but then to provide them tools to optimize their programs to understand how to overcome or to be robust against those resistance elements. So that's sort of part number one. The other use that we have for genomic sequences is actually in guiding, for instance, our vaccine portfolio, as well as non-traditional portfolios, like, for instance, antivirulence, where you want to ask the question, and particularly with an emphasis on low middle income countries, are you choosing the right antigens or toxins as your focus? And that's really critical. The last thing you want to do is get to a final product and recognize that you're leaving, a third of the isolates on the table.
And another comment on that. Thanks, Erin. It's a great example. And I would argue that the global surveillance initiatives are absolutely essential to R&D for at least two reasons. One is again, thinking about how we work with our partners, we rely upon prioritization based on what we understand to be the problems around the world. So we utilize levers, for example, the WHO priority pathogen list or the CDC threat assessments to understand what are the pathogens that we care about, what are the drug resistance levels, where are those bugs happening. The R&D process for antibacterials is very, very long. And our ability to sort of transition and shift towards new threat pathogens is not rapid. It relies crucially upon incoming information on what are the bacteria, what are the resistance mechanisms, how can we treat those effectively to identify next generations of therapeutics. And I think that the second problem I'll highlight is a bit of awareness. So I take a poll of the audience. Raise your hand if you have heard the term Acinetobacter baumannii. That's hands, it's great. It's a fantastic outcome, right? So usually when I have a conversation about Acinetobacter baumannii, there are blank stares by everyone. So first of all, it's very difficult to pronounce Latin name. It is a pathogen that impacts really just hospitalized, critically ill patients. It's not something you get in the community. It's not something your child will have as a consequence of an ear infection. Yet it is one of the top ranked WHO priority pathogens. It is a CDC urgent threat. And there's very little generalized awareness. And in fact, knowing what was the global scope of Acinetobacter baumannii as a resistant pathogen threat is relatively new. We knew that there was a dissemination of resistance to preferred first-line agents like carbapenems in the early 2000s, but really to understand what is the global impact of this particular pathogen is based on incoming data that we get from these surveillance systems now. And I think a real limitation is that around surveillance, which I hope will be improving in the future, is that we have the best resolution of understanding around antimicrobial resistant threats in places that tend to have the lowest absolute burden of antimicrobial resistance. We need to take away sort of the black box of what is happening in places where surveillance is much more limited. And I hope with global efforts, we'll be able to understand that in much better resolution.
I would echo that enormously. We need to do a much better job globally in real time with the surveillance so we can see how things are changing, where they're changing, and where they're spreading. This is tough. We need to think, a decade plus out. And given the limited resources we have to invest in the space, we really need to make these difficult decisions with as much information as possible from the regions that are showing that greatest acceleration of resistance. And I'd add one more piece, and I think as it relates to all of this, and we think about the lack of resources, we also need to remember we have a lack of scientists that are being trained in this area, both physicians, clinicians, as well as bench scientists, and we're losing them over time as there's been less capital, not enough innovation around the world, and attention to this is we're going to also lose capability to address these problems if we don't continue to invest and stay ahead of it.
Thank you, Henry. I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Richard, who's going to be repeating some questions from our virtual audience.
Yeah, thank you. There has been quite a lot of activity online. So there's a lot of interest in what you're doing to enable more equitable access to antibiotics. So Victoria Saint asks, could we hear more details from the panel about what their own organizations are doing on equitable access, for example, the plan mentioned by Erin Duffy, and what they see needs to be done in the global governance ecosystem to really tackle inequities. And then in a similar vein, and also to Erin Duffy, so I'm going to take that in the same stride, Sebastian Schönherr asks, how do you hold product developers that receive your support accountable to implement their stewardship and access plans? Are there any binding access and stewardship conditions?
Okay, so I'll give this a whirl. So as I mentioned, we do have contractual language with every product developer, to prepare a non-confidential stewardship and access plan, and the preparation of that is required by the time that they're entering pivotal studies. So for treatment and prevention, that's your first phase 3 program, and in diagnostics, that's really at the validation and verification stage. But before that, of course, there's no sense in getting there if you haven't thought about this all along. And so there are a couple of elements here. But certainly we will have, again, we end for treatment and prevention at the end of first in human studies. So not phase 2 or phase 3, but we will continue to check in and encourage these product developers to think along this line. And then it really comes down to a focus on IP. Well, I think first, the company has to figure out sort of what happened with Entasis and zoliflodacin and GUARDP, but figure out the countries that the company will invest in, marketing the drug, and then identify the rest of the countries that would be the subject of the stewardship and access plan. So that's really critical, to this element, and then to secure the appropriate IP rights. It's just not just patents, it's the whole estate, and to be very mindful about how this will play out. So it's a long process. And again, we do have this guide that we've published now on our website that helps product developers. The other thing I'll say about that I mentioned is that where feasible, reasonable, et cetera, in the work plans for the programs that we do support, we are encouraging to a greater and greater degree a focus on low middle income country access. I'll give you an example. We have a non-traditional program that employs a polymeric protein, and it's the initial formulation of it was a liquid-based formulation meant to be used for prosthetic joint infections. So used during surgery and then, sort of irrigate and done. But we recognized that were the company able to identify an alternative formulation where it could be used in, for traumatic surgery, cesarean section in low middle income countries, which is a huge issue. We gave them some support to do a feasibility study there, ask, can we develop a novel formulation? And the answer is yes. And so now we're engaged with them and with some support from the Clinton Health Access to ask what are the best indications, what are the right countries to go into, how do we demonstrate the value of this drug both preclinically and clinically. And so we're doing more and more of that kind of activity.
Can I just follow up from that, Erin, especially because there was the word accountability in that question. Mm-hmm. So just to kind of follow on, what is CARB specifically doing on the CARB accountability for the product developers front? Like, do you have sort of enforced checklist, or is it more of a gentle encouragement? What exactly are you looking for?
I would call it gentle encouragement, or maybe, well, right. So there's nothing specific to that, but I will say that actually the Wellcome Trust is ultimately, again, because we will end at the end of phase 1, but Wellcome Trust will continue in partnership with us, but ultimately they're the final consumers of that.
Mm-hmm. Gonna bring it back to Richard to follow up with some more questions from our virtual audience.
Yeah, thank you. We've got one from Tim Jinks at Wellcome. Commercial pressures and sometimes the concept of stewardship are limiting the access to much needed antibiotics in places where infectious diseases and AMR are most damaging. How can antibiotic innovation better serve the needs of all people? Not directed to anyone specific.
Maybe I'll
Yeah.
give it a go.
Super, go ahead.
I think everybody recognizes access and stewardship are two sides of the same coin, and balancing those two is what Tim is talking about. And if you turn one on, stewardship, too much, you block access. I can give you what GUARDPs sort of approach to this. The way we approach it is based off of the burden of AMR in a particular region, and gauging the need for a particular agent. Our solutions are quite custom made for a particular country or a region. So we truly believe that one size fits all model will not work for all agents and in all regions. And I think it's this customization that will give us the ability to fine tune between access and stewardship. There are many aspects to stewardship. I think stewardship could be defined very narrowly as just stewarding an antibiotic and its use, but it also could be a very broad kind of definition, which begins from how is the antibiotic used? Is it used the best way possible in the right indication? Is it the right dose? Based off of modeling and probability of therapeutic target attainment. You can start there. How can you optimize on those? Are there combinations of antibiotics that will potentially slow down resistance? And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is around diagnostics. Mm-hmm. And, what is the capability for diagnostics at the patient level, to diagnose infection and to test susceptibility. And then at the larger surveillance level as well, what are the capabilities in a particular region? All of these obviously will determine how access is provided. GUARDP's approach is one of assessment initially, providing capabilities and trying to kind of bring people up to a standard that can then support the use of the antibiotic. We plan to use mechanisms such as early access mechanisms to sort of gently introduce antibiotics and sort of monitor the use. We will do studies in these countries to generate real world data, which may not be as controlled like your pivotal studies, but they would still be somewhat of a controlled situation where we can monitor how they're being used and to gather data on effectiveness, to gather data on emergence of resistance. It is this kind of stepped approach, if you will, that we are giving to mechanisms of access. And ultimately, there will need to be stepping up, and I think, but it is a stepped approach and it's cautious. And one could criticize and say that it denies access. But I think if you think of this as a long-term project and you want sustainability, that is the responsible way of doing this.
I guess I would just add from the innovation side, since that was part of the question, I think, is that, again, it comes back to encouraging the product developer early on to not focus just on the pathogen, but rather on the syndrome and the target product profile. And that includes everything from the route of administration to the population to, what are the particular syndromes you're going to try to study in the clinic and launch with. And so, I think recently the AMR Hub published their, two big priorities. One is, for sepsis or bloodstream infections and the other for pneumonias. And so for product developers to be mindful that if these are the key needs, particularly in low and middle income countries, you better be focused on that. And so, engineering the right activity and efficacy and appropriate animal models infection to demonstrate those performance characteristics is critical, because otherwise then you're developing something that won't be appropriate for use.
Thank you. I've got one more question from the virtual audience, and then I will go back to the floor. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, one last one, thank you. Specifically to Henry Skinner this time. You mentioned the AMR Fund as helper towards companies' approach to deliver new drugs to LMICs. Could we have more details on what the actual means of help look like?
Could you say that? I'm not sure I followed the whole question.
Sorry. So you mentioned the AMR Action Fund as a helper towards companies' approaches to delivering new drugs to LMICs. Could we have more details as to what that help looks like?
So I think that that's a work in progress. We are just getting started. I think what we're looking at is holistically the global challenge of these key pathogens and where they are. Much like Aaron said, with CARB has taken a holistic view of the pathogen, the mechanism, the indications, and route of administration, et cetera, to try to maximize that opportunity and to make sure that the product, as it's being developed, is going to accomplish that. So that may be taking a little more time in formulation to make sure that you've got a facile product profile that's going to have that utility and the like. We will very strongly look for partners like GUARDP and others where we can actually get data in some of these situations as well, that I think is critical to understanding the applicability, how you take it forward and be that data real world, which I think ultimately is key, but also controlled data in some of these settings so that you get empiric information as to the clinical utility and an understanding of how to approach it. That's going to take partnership. I don't think that's something that many of these companies can drive themselves. I think it's even challenging for large companies to take such an approach. But we will investigate that, and where possible and practical, we will help facilitate and finance that approach.
Would anybody else like to add?
It's kind of a tangential issue, but I think one that every people in this room might be well aware of, and it was something I alluded to initially. The real world data that I think needs to be generated is best done in low and middle income countries, just because of the burden of disease over there, and you know, it's just more efficient to do it there, and in the process also provide drug to these patients. That's easier said than done, as Henry alluded to. And as part of what GUARDP does is we also do a lot of capability assessment, and at the sites that we work in, we try to fill gaps that are at the sites. Initially, of course, we work with sites who have clinical trials, some kind of clinical trial capacity. However, what we in our model, there is a capacity building component that is quite critical, and I think we think that is going to be quite important. Much as we saw with COVID, you were able to operationalize a trial pretty rapidly, and that's because there exists, these loose networks right now that could be brought together pretty quickly. It does not exist for a lot of these serious bacterial infections that we're talking about, where patients are in the ICU, they're critically ill, often unconscious, and those kinds of clinical trials are hard to do. The sites need to be trained. They need to have good capacity to run those trials. They need to have good diagnostic capabilities and to turn things around pretty quickly. So part of this is capacity building, and I think that's where all of the actors that you see here, I think we're all kind of doing different pieces of the puzzle, but really it's around coalescing on that larger goal of having a fairly robust network, if you will, of actors who around the globe, not just in US and Europe, who can then be activated in the event of another pandemic, or there are epidemics happening all the time, but God forbid another pandemic.
You hit on a critical issue there. Ideal world, we would not have a lag between the first approval of a new antibiotic that has utility in LMI countries where the need is highest because of this problem. So in an ideal world, I think what you just described of building that capability to run a truly global study where you could get this data much sooner to allow for a much more rapid access to the patients that need it than is currently possible.
Right. And to build on that, I think that piece of evidence is missing even for US and Europe, as a result of which there's a lag in development of guidelines for use of these new agents. I think that's well recognized. I mean, Kevin has published on this, and it is a problem. And again, real world data is what will fix that issue. And it's up to all of us to sort of coalesce on this and say, this is a priority, this needs to be done, this needs to be funded. It is part of development. I think that's the key. Just because a drug is approved does not mean development ends. Go ahead.
I think this is a really wonderful point, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I think this links back to how I think about the problem that there's fundamentally a pipeline issue. And I think it's useful to maybe pivot disease areas and think about it slightly differently, right? So if you think about oncology research and development, right, there's a massive global pipeline of R&D investment into new oncologic products, looking at a wide range of cancers, right? And around this has been built an ecosystem of clinical trials networks, cancer centers that are really built, or foundationally built around this type of data generation to be done in highly efficient manners, right? And this is a partnership across pharmaceutical companies, biotechnologies, funding agencies, regulatory agencies, academics. And this is a really rich system to generate new data that is essential to understand use. And the pipeline of antibiotics is very, very small. And when you go to seek trial sites, you go to hospitals that have limited or no experience in running a clinical trial, let alone a very challenging clinical trial in critically ill patients in intensive care unit settings. So the rebuilding of a single clinical trial system for a single product is highly inefficient, it's extremely costly, and it's difficult without a mass of new innovation to move into that ecosystem, to build that ecosystem on its own. It needs to be built together.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? I'm going to go to the back there.
Okay, thanks. Hi there, I'm Leslie Oakley from the Global AMR R&D Hub. I'd just like to point out, we did a report and it highlighted a novel policy option of funding therapeutic and diagnostic pairs. I'd just like the panel's opinion on that in terms of the development process for these. Thanks.
Anybody like to comment on the report?
So may I ask for a little more specificity in what you'd like to hear about that?
Yeah, it was one of the novel policy options that we came across during when we published this report. And it was just highlighting this as an option that developers or funding people could actually consider. So funding pairs of diagnostics and therapeutics rather than just antibiotics on their own.
Yeah, so I would say we don't, well, I mean, I'm sitting next to a guy in a big diagnostics company. I'm sure you have a lot to say about that. But I think just a comment that we have focused our diagnostics pillar specifically on what we're calling aligned by design. We were calling it better together, but then we learned that that was sort of a no-no for, Brexit type. So anyway, so aligned by design. And the whole purpose of that is to focus the diagnostic solutions on what will help both in the clinical trial conduct and also in the market uptake of the products in our treatment portfolio specifically. So I wouldn't call it companion diagnostic, but I would call it supportive diagnostic. And that's the focus that we have today.
I can take a comment as well. So I believe very strongly that diagnostics for bacterial infections are innovation in this space is really essential to drive innovation in therapeutic approaches, right? So it goes hand in hand that the recognition of the specific type of bacterial infection and an optimal treatment for it enables the selection of the appropriate antibiotic. It enables the deselection of inappropriate antibiotics simultaneously, right? So it's solving the problem of the ecosystem simultaneously. And I believe that the diagnostic space for antimicrobial resistance suffers from many of the same problems that we see in the pharmaceutical and the therapeutic space as well. So I endorse the point that additional funding and innovation and approaches towards more novel diagnostics is essential. And it's really, I think, to Erin's point, there is the challenges and the essentiality of innovation in what we would consider conventional diagnostics, which is really decades old technology, taking small pieces of Wattman paper and being able to determine when you put it onto an agar dish, the diffusion distance that you see for bacterial growth that you do in a microbiology lab, or that informs on the outcome of an antibiotic, versus advanced technologies that utilize imaging approaches, PCR-based techniques, novel diagnostics, which are not really incentivized because of cost-related barriers for the developers and for the end users that I think are limiting the innovation approaches. So I think these really need to happen hand in hand.
I would add, one of the challenges in that approach, although it makes a lot of intuitive sense to have them lined up, is you've got a small innovative company developing the drug, and then you ask them to develop a diagnostic, which is a very, very different technological challenge, both the box and the assay, coupled with the very difficult business challenges to it as well. So you start to stitch those things together, and I think it's awfully difficult as a small company to develop the antibiotic, let alone ask them for two miracles to develop both hand in hand and line that up temporally and geographically so that you could actually apply it broadly. I think conceptually it's great. I think if we have the diagnostic innovation and success, ideally that's holistic, and every antibiotic development will benefit from that precision and rapidity that will come.
Yeah, and I think the issue of diagnostic capability in lower and middle income countries particularly is it's well recognized that it's not quite where it needs to be. And it's quite broad. It goes way beyond antibiotics. I mean, think of cancer therapies and so on, where you cannot use many of these drugs that are highly efficacious just because you don't have the capabilities. What GUARDP is doing, I mean, we actually have a MOU with FIND for our gonorrhea program to come up with, a diagnostic that is cheap, that's point of care, not near point of care, but actual point of care, and potentially, we'll do some susceptibility testing as well. We feel that good diagnostics is part and parcel of good stewardship. It needs to be built in there. And I think while initial costs might seem to be higher with some of these newer technologies, in the long run, again, I think they could leapfrog a lot of years of lack of good diagnostics in these regions and really help with surveillance efforts as well. And so again, it comes to sort of a coordinated effort to fund these in a very holistic way. I mean, where you talk about policy, I think that's where it sort of connects. And to really look at this in a very broad, as a broad basis for use of antibiotics.
I guess I just want to comment, further to Henry's point there. I think we agree with you that, designing a drug or a vaccine or, prevention is tough enough. But, for us, that's why, because we do have this whole pillar of diagnostics, we're asking the question early, which is, so for instance, we've talked, many of us here, about beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor combinations. Okay, that's a great example for where you want a good diagnostic. And so asking the product developers early on, what do you need? And then going out to the diagnostics network that we have and saying, do you have something? Is it research use only? Do you have a platform that can be expanded to a new sample type or whatever, so that there's sort of gradients of need, the worst of which is if you have to do new tech and new box, nobody likes that. But I think in so doing, hopefully there's an opportunity to capitalize on, many of these before you get to the clinic, so that you can have that utility.
Thanks. We've got one final question from our virtual audience.
This one's from Anna Zorzit from React. And she asks, how do we avoid antibiotic nationalism similar to what we have seen with COVID vaccines for novel antibiotics, especially since incentive models like subscription models are designed for high income countries? So how do we avoid antibiotic nationalism?
Who would like to tackle this first?
I mean, certainly in our own shop, this was the genesis of the Stewardship and Access Plan, that again, upon regulatory approval, wherever that is, that there would be a separation among those countries where the company wishes to market, and then a joint business plan with the Wellcome Trust for those other countries, so that we try to avoid that at the outset.
I would go a step beyond that. I think most of us who have conducted clinical trials will agree that if you conduct a clinical trial in a particular country, you're obligated to provide access to that country. I think that should be the rule de facto. It doesn't always happen. And I think that could avoid some of these nationalism kind of principles, because if you look at most of the recent antibiotics, as you well know, Aaron, that have been approved in the US, for instance, very little of the US population have been involved in those trials. They're dominantly done outside of the US, in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere. And so I think if we start there and say, you have to provide access to the countries that you did your trials in, I think that's a good place to start. And then, it's probably up to people like us and large companies to make sure that you're meeting the needs for, wherever the public health burden is the greatest.
Can I just quickly ask you, Suba, when you said, let's do the trials in the countries that need it most. Just trying to play devil's advocate here. Is there a risk that companies would then end up moving their trials more to Europe and US?
I guess I'd actually flip that question a little bit. What I mean is that if you have to go to conduct your pivotal trial you have to do it efficiently. You have a certain time frame. The best way to do that is really to have a global, trial. And that's what is happening. That's what we're seeing happen. And my point is that if you have done your trials there, your registrational trials there, start by providing access to those countries at the get-go, not wait for years and years and years. And that's kind of what I was alluding to. Previously, what I had said was with regards to real world evidence and what GUARDP does. And that's how we hope to provide access. And we select those countries based off of public health burden of, or, you know, for as a fit for a particular drug. I hope I clarified.
Yeah, I would add, I think there's other things that we can look to as well. We can look to reduce the burden of bringing these new drugs to low and middle income countries. Everything from regulatory changes, and I was excited to see the development of the African Medicines Agency as a potential route to facilitate easier access, less expensive access, faster access. Little things such as packaging, right? Can we have a universal packaging, maybe four languages universally, so that, again, you're not burdened with 148 different packages, manufacturing challenges, et cetera. So I think there's macro things that can be done as well that will facilitate access and accelerate it.
Has anybody else got any minor things to add to that point? If not, I think we're in the final 5 minutes, so I will try to wrap up. I've got too many notes and they're all scribbles, so trying to find the key points is going to be tricky here. But first of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their great answers and their involvement in the panel here today. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us, both here in the room in Berlin, as well as virtually. Thank you for all the questions that you've submitted. So we were here to discuss the challenges and the solutions that could try to improve stewardship and access and R&D for antibiotics in particular. I think we started off a bit more negatively, you know, with all the challenges, and we're trying to spin it a bit more positively, but then we started throwing in lots of different aspects that all contribute towards, you know, trying to battle this complex problem. We've heard a lot about the fragility of the economic model, with lots of incentives that are currently being applied, but lots more that need to happen. We've heard that an innovation cannot work in isolation, with R&D, that you need the support from governments, policies, regulatory authorities to try and improve access and stewardship to bring medicines to patients. There were points around the clinical trials networks being quite fragile right now, and the way to try and improve ways to gather data, real world data across the globe, similar to some of the you know, therapies such as the oncology sector, which is much more robust. How can we actually try to build capabilities across the world to develop better clinical trial data for antibiotic development? We also heard about the importance of diagnostics and how they will supplement stewardship and access, and that whilst we would like to see them coupled closer together in practice, that's quite a big ask from any particular organization. So just maybe partnering better or more formally with the diagnostic space, you know, for example, find who are leading in diagnostics in general. So, you know, how can we actually clue these things up much better together, so that when we develop drugs, that they are appropriate and are effective for people, and that we know exactly what sort of antibiotics we need to give to them because the diagnostics are there. We also heard about the importance of global surveillance systems to making sure that that can inform R&D as it is being developed, so that we can rely on relevant, good quality data coming in to develop the next generation of therapeutics. And I think those were sort of some of the key points that I wanted to highlight here today. But, you know, overall, it just kind of goes to show that this isn't just a one solution fits all problems, that there's multiple different pathways that need to fit in, and that we do have many important players here contributing, but more needs to be done, and that this problem is here to stay. Just because COVID's around doesn't necessarily mean that antimicrobials are not needed. They're going to be here to stay. Resistance is possibly increasing, so we still need urgently support, awareness, funding in that area. And I think that's it from me. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you.